It seems eternal, immutable, like a fragment of ancient Rome, miraculously transported to the shores of California, the Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco. Its reflection in the quiet lagoon is a postcard the city sends to the world, a symbol of harmony, a haven of beauty, a monument to civilization carved in stone. But this is a lie. Every curve of its columns, every crack on its facade, it is all part of a grand, almost perfect deception. This image of eternity that so captivates us today was conceived as an illusion, a theatrical set with a predetermined expiration date. To see the truth, we must rewind the film more than 100 years, away from the serene swans and wedding photographers, to a time when, on this very spot, there was nothing but the viscous, sucking mire of the bay, where instead of a majestic rotunda, there was primordial chaos. Mud, millions of cubic meters of silt dredged from the ocean floor, a place where the very ground beneath your feet was a fake. This palace was never meant to survive its first birthday. It was assembled like a kit from the most temporary materials imaginable. A wooden frame coated in a mixture of cheap plaster and jute fiber, a material made not to stand, but to crumble beautifully under the Californian rains. It was built to rot within a single year. Its birth was not an act of love for art. It was the result of a collision between two opposing forces. On one side, the icy, cynical calculation of an industrial dictator named Charles Moore, a man who needed to prove to the world that his empire had not collapsed in fire and ash. On the other, the hazy, mystical dreams of architect Bernard Maybeck, an eccentric and philosopher whom his colleagues considered a harmless oddball. One wanted to build a statement of power, the other, an elegy to the mortality of all things. This palace is their shared child, born of conflict, a monument paid for not by faith in beauty, but by the desperate desire of San Francisco's elite to save their fortunes after the great earthquake of 1906 wiped their city off the map. So how did this magnificent lie, born of ash and greed, manage to deceive time itself? How did a temporary stage set, sentenced to death before it was even born, become the immortal soul of one of the world's greatest cities? To understand why the Palace of Fine Arts came to be, you have to breathe the air of San Francisco in 1906. It was the smell of smoke, damp earth, and panic. The city lay in ruins. But for the handful of men who ruled it from their offices, it wasn't just buildings that had collapsed. It was the market. Investors were fleeing. The capital that had flowed here for decades like a golden river was now seeking safer harbors. It was a financial hemorrhage, and it had to be stopped. Immediately. The story of universal unity and heroic rebirth is a convenient myth. The truth, as always, is written in the ledgers. And to read it, you have to look into the eyes of those who were writing the checks. Here is William Crocker, heir to a railroad empire. Every cent of his fortune was paid for in sweat and steel. His family was one of those that laid the steel arteries across the continent, using thousands of nameless Chinese laborers as disposable building material. For him, a ruined city was not a tragedy. It was a threat to his assets. And here, the Spreckles family, the Sugar Kings. Their mansions in San Francisco were built on a ruthless monopoly squeezed from Hawaiian plantations. The sweetness on their table had the bitter aftertaste of other generations' sweat. When their mansions began to shake, they felt a threat not to their homes, but to their business model. And of course, Michael DeYoung, the newspaper magnate. His weapon was not steel or sugar, but printer's ink. He understood that the main battle would be fought not on the streets, but on the front pages. He needed to sell the world a new story, a story of a city stronger than fire, because the value of the vast tracts of land he owned depended directly on that story. And so, in 1910, these men and 36 others like them gather in a stuffy, smoke-filled room. This is not a city recovery council. It is a war room for saving capital. In 2 hours, just 2 hours, 34 millionaires donate $4 million. By today's standards, that's over 100 million. But don't be fooled by the word donate. This was not an act of generosity. It was the purchase of the most expensive insurance policy in history. They weren't saving a city. They were saving their dynasties. They were investing in a gigantic, dazzling advertisement called the Panama-Pacific International Exposition. Their goal was to shout to the entire world, "We are still here. We are open for business. Bring your money here." Every dollar thrown into that pot was stained by its past, with the blood of the gold rush, the soot of locomotive furnaces, the humidity of sugarcane. It was a volatile mix of fear and ambition, and it was on this foundation, on this money soaked in cynicism and a desperate will to survive, that they would build their temple. A temple dedicated not to God or art, but to the power of American capital. At the head of this grand enterprise stood a man who spoke not the language of art, but of tonnage and horsepower, Charles C. Moore. Officially, the president of the exposition. Unofficially, its dictator. Moore was not a patron of the arts or a connoisseur of beauty. He was an engineer, a man of steel and concrete who saw the world as a set of complex problems demanding precise, ruthless solutions. For him, the entire exposition was one gigantic statement. The opening of the Panama Canal had just redrawn the planet's trade routes, and Moore was obsessed with an idea. San Francisco must become the main port in this new world. Not just a city, but the center of the Western Hemisphere. And architecture had to serve this purpose. It was not a canvas, it was a weapon. The location for this statement was chosen with cold calculation, not in the city center, but on its edge, on the unstable, salty mud of the reclaimed Harbor View Marsh. Land created from literally nothing. The perfect metaphor for the new image they were sculpting for San Francisco. Here, on this artificial soil, Moore intended to erect a temporary empire. He demanded grandeur from his architects in the Beaux-Arts style. Symmetry, order, triumphal arches, colonnades reaching for the sky. The architecture of power. Architecture that screams of its own dominance. And into this world of precise calculations and imperial ambitions walked a man who seemed like a glitch in the system. Bernard Maybeck, architect, philosopher, mystic. He received the commission for the Palace of Fine Arts almost by accident, as a consolation prize when he wasn't chosen for the main committee. He would show up to meetings in a homespun suit and sandals, and his eyes lacked the glint of steel. In them, there was a dreamlike haze. To his meeting with Moore and his committee of millionaires, Maybeck came not with blueprints for a pompous palace. He brought with him old engravings by an 18th century Italian artist, Piranesi. They depicted the majestic ruins of ancient Rome being consumed by nature. And looking into the eyes of these pragmatic masters of the New World, Maybeck made the most insane proposal of his life. He didn't propose they build a palace. He proposed they build its beautiful, melancholic ruins. He spoke not of triumph, but of sadness, of that sweet sorrow one feels when witnessing faded grandeur. His idea was heretical. He wanted to build a monument, not to civilization's strength, but to its fragility. His palace was meant, from the very beginning, to carry the seed of its own decay, reminding all that any empire, no matter how powerful, will one day turn to dust. But art, Maybeck argued, art would outlive them all. Moore's statement was about power forged in the present. Maybeck's statement was about beauty surviving in eternity. In any other situation, he would have simply been shown the door. But something about his insane idea resonated with them. Perhaps deep down, these men who had just seen their own world turn to ash understood the fragility he spoke of, and they agreed. Two statements, one of power, the other of decay, and both were cemented into the same foundation. This conflict of ideas, embedded in the very heart of the palace, was a time bomb, and it was destined to sprout through the plaster and wood, defining the fate of this place forever. Before raising the walls, the land itself had to be created. The Harbor View territory, chosen for the exhibition, was not just a wasteland. It was a wound on the body of the bay, a marshy, treacherous quagmire where salt water mixed with mud. You couldn't build here. You could only drown. And so began a battle not with stone and steel, but with nature itself. It was a war on a primal scale. Giant, roaring monsters entered the arena, dredgers. Day and night, they gnawed at the bay floor with their steel jaws, sucking up millions of cubic yards of sand, silt, and sea mud. Through giant pipes, like the arteries of a prehistoric beast, this pulsating sludge was spewed onto the shore, filling the marshes. 635 acres of New California were literally born from the murky water. It was an act of creation, recorded not in sacred texts, but in engineering reports. The construction site turned into a hellish landscape. It was a viscous, unstable world of gray. Workers, knee-deep in mud, resembled shadows trudging along the bottom of a dried-up ocean. Every step was a struggle. Horses, pulling wagons with materials, got stuck in the mire. Equipment sank into the insatiable ooze. Legends from those days tell of men who were nearly swallowed whole by the swamp. The engineers worked on the verge of a nervous breakdown. The new land, created so hastily, didn't have time to settle and compact. It breathed. It moved. The ground subsided under the weight of the first structures, forcing them to recalculate the loads again and again. They were trying to impose the strict geometry of their blueprints onto a living, capricious element. This picture of primordial chaos is the key to understanding the entire design. The land on which the Palace of Fine Arts was to stand was as much an illusion as the future building itself. It was artificial, temporary, borrowed from the ocean. Every stone that would later form the base of the rotunda was laid on unstable ground, on a foundation of sand and water. And this original sin of creation, this inherent instability, remained forever in the genetic code of the place. The palace was born from mud, and this mud remembered its oceanic origins, patiently waiting for the moment to reclaim everything that had been built upon its surface. The rising from the mud was only the first act. The return to it was merely a matter of time. When the land was finally tamed, the raising of the walls began. But the word raising is inappropriate here. This wasn't construction in the usual sense. It was the creation of a set piece, an act of grand stage magic, where the main trick lay in the material itself. It was called staff, a simple, almost mundane word for the substance from which a dream was woven. Up close, it was a coarse, unremarkable mixture, cheap building plaster mixed with jute fiber, essentially with common furniture batting. No marble, no granite, no hint of eternity. We see the workers' hands, calloused, covered in white dust. They are not laying stone upon stone. They are slathering this damp, pliable mass onto the giant wooden skeletons of future columns and arches. It was more like the work of a sculptor than a stonemason. They were sculpting an illusion, creating a thin, fragile skin over a skeleton of 3 million linear feet of the most common Douglas fir. This material was the quintessence of deception. It was chosen not in spite of its impermanence, but precisely because of it. First, it was incredibly cheap. Every bas relief, every Corinthian capital was paid for, not with a fortune, but with pennies. This allowed for maximum visual impact at minimum cost, the ideal formula for a project that was, in essence, a commercial enterprise. Second, it was fast. The plaster set in a matter of hours, allowing entire palaces to be erected on a timeline unthinkable for stone construction. The race against time was won at the material selection stage. But there was a third, most important, almost sinister reason. A reason born in the mind of the mystic architect, Bernard Maybeck. He knew how staff would behave in the damp, salty wind of San Francisco. He knew the plaster would absorb moisture, that under the very first winter rains, hairline cracks, thin as a spider's web, would appear on its surface, that the paint would begin to peel, revealing the coarse texture of the fibers. He designed the building to die beautifully. Every cornice, every crevice was designed to yield to the elements, to allow nature to begin its slow work of returning the place to primordial chaos. He wasn't just building ruins. He embedded a mechanism of self-destruction into the very flesh of his creation. It was a brilliant deception, stitched into every molecule of the palace. People who would look upon it were meant to see the noble patina of ages, the traces of bygone civilizations, but in reality, they would be seeing only the result of programmed, accelerated decay. The grandeur revealed to them would be nothing more than a meticulously staged spectacle of decay. And the faster it crumbled, the more convincing its antiquity would seem. This plaster empire did not rise on its own. It was built by hands, tens of thousands of hands. At the peak of construction, more than 50,000 people transformed the drained swamp into the busiest place on the continent. It was a veritable army, but they fought not for glory or for an idea. They fought for a day's wage. Who were these people? Their names are not carved on the friezes of the palaces. Their faces have been erased by time. But it was they who were the true creators of this marvel. Many were immigrants, recently off the ships, speaking dozens of languages: Irish, Italians, Chinese. People for whom this construction site was the only hope of survival in a new, foreign world. Every nail driven into the wooden frame was paid for by their separation from home. Every ton of plaster hoisted onto the scaffolding was weighed on the scales of their despair and hope. The working conditions were brutal. We see archival footage, men without hard hats or safety lines, balancing at dizzying heights. They mix concrete with their bare hands. Safety regulations were a concept from the future. Official reports speak of minimal accidents, but this is only part of the truth. Behind the scenes of this celebration of progress, tragedies were hidden. At least 11 workers died, falling from the scaffolding or crushed by building materials. Their deaths became another, invisible layer in the foundation of this splendor. Tension grew not only upwards with the walls, but also outwards among the workers' barracks. The unions, gaining strength in California, saw this gigantic construction project as the ideal battleground. They demanded better conditions, higher pay, and recognition of their rights. The threat of a general strike hung in the air. A single day of stoppage could cost millions. A week could derail the exhibition's opening and bring the entire, carefully constructed financial pyramid crashing down. And here, Charles Moore, The dictator of the exhibition took the stage once again. He saw the union leaders not as negotiating partners, but as enemies sabotaging his grand plan. He acted with an iron fist. Threats, bribery, dismissals. He used the entire arsenal of an industrial magnate to crush any dissent in its infancy. To him, these 50,000 people were not an army, but a resource. A human material, just like wood and plaster, to be used with maximum efficiency. This dream of the elite was built by the hands of the nameless, people whose names history has not preserved, but whose fingerprints remain forever in the hardened plaster. They were building a palace they could perhaps never afford a ticket to enter. They were creating a symbol of art and culture, without the time or energy to even lift their eyes and admire what they were making. They were the silent soldiers in this swamp, and their sweat became the mortar that bound this grand illusion together for good. The conflict brewing on the construction site was merely a reflection of another, quieter, but no less ferocious war, a war of ideas. It was waged not in the language of union demands, but in the language of blueprints, sketches, and architectural models. This was an aesthetic war, and Bernard Maybeck found himself a lone guerrilla in its midst. To understand his position, one need only look at the exposition's master plan. It was a triumph of order. 10 main palaces, designed by the country's best architects, were arranged along strict, symmetrical axes: the Palace of Machinery, the Palace of Food Products, the Palace of Liberal Arts. They all spoke the same language, the language of Beaux-Arts, a style synonymous with imperial power and financial success. This was an architecture of self-confidence. Massive, perfectly proportioned buildings adorned with triumphal arches and statues of heroes. They were like athletes flexing their muscles. Their message was simple and clear. We are the center of the world. We are the new Roman Empire. Look at our strength. And against this parade of symmetry and pomposity, Maybeck's project looked like a dissonance, like a deliberate mistake in a flawless equation. His Palace of Fine Arts was pushed to the very edge of the exposition, like an unwanted relative. It was the only one that broke the strict geometry. It was asymmetrical. Its lines were soft, flowing. It didn't stand in a proud pose, but seemed to grow out of the ground, surrounded not by manicured lawns, but by the wild, overgrown banks of a lagoon. The other architects looked at his sketches with a bewilderment that turned to contempt. They were building palaces for the present, for a moment of triumph. He was building ruins from the future, a monument to the idea that this triumph was not eternal. In the corridors, they called him a madman, an eccentric who didn't understand the main task, to glorify American power. Newspaper critics caught this wave. They attacked the yet-to-be-built palace, calling his project tasteless plasterwork and a melancholic fantasy, out of place at a celebration of progress. They didn't see the philosophy in his idea. They saw only weakness. While the entire exposition shouted about the conquest of nature, Maybeck whispered that nature, in the end, always wins. He was one against all, against Moore's pragmatism, against the academic rigor of his colleagues, against a public opinion that craved glitter and optimism. Every curve of his rotunda, every tree planted out of line, was an act of defiance. He wasn't building just another pavilion. He was waging his own personal war for the right to sadness, for the idea that there can be more greatness in melancholy than in the most deafening triumph. And while the others competed to see who could build the most impressive facade, Maybeck was creating a soul, a sad, contemplative, but living soul. To understand what Maybeck truly wanted to say, you have to rise above ground level. up to where silent figures are frozen atop the giant colonnade. Their official name is Contemplation and Meditation upon Art. But they have another secret name, the Weeping Maidens. We see the sculptor, Ulrich Ellerhusen, working in his studio, turning lifeless clay into human figures. He creates women with lowered heads and half-closed eyes. Their poses express not joy or triumph, but a deep, universal sorrow. These are not muses inspiring creativity. They are mourners at the funeral of civilization. Bernard Maybeck stands beside him. He isn't giving the sculptor technical instructions. He is speaking to him as a philosopher, a poet. He is explaining his most cherished idea. These women are not just sad. They are mourning the very mortality of greatness. They look down upon the world of men, upon its palaces and empires, and see not their splendor, but their inevitable transformation into dust. And above their heads, at the very top of each column, Maybeck places another, most mysterious symbol, a stone box resembling an ancient sarcophagus, a coffin. But this is not a symbol of the end. Maybeck explains, from these sarcophagi, from the death of old ideas, new plants, new life, symbolically grow. It is the endless cycle of decay and rebirth. The palace comes to life as a giant coded message. The enormous rotunda, open to all the winds, is our civilization, majestic but vulnerable. And inside, under its protection, is a small enclosed building, the exhibition hall. This is art itself. Maybeck is telling us, empires fall, columns crumble, but what is kept inside, beauty, ideas, thought, is eternal. And he adds a final brilliant touch. He designs the drainage system so that during a rainstorm, the water doesn't just run off the cornices. It collects and streams in thin rivulets directly down the faces of the grieving maidens. Real tears fall from the sky. In these moments, the palace ceases to be mere architecture. It begins to breathe. It feels. It weeps. Maybeck didn't just build a building. He created a mechanism for experiencing emotion. He made plaster and wood speak of the most important thing, that true beauty is born not from the joy of victory, but from the wise and sorrowful awareness of one's own finitude. And this philosophy, encrypted in stone and water, proved to be stronger and more enduring than all the empires it was meant to mourn. Maybeck's idea of beautiful decay was brilliant, but he failed to account for one thing. Nature decided not to play along with his philosophical concept, but to stage a dress rehearsal for the apocalypse. The winter of 1914 to 1915 descended upon San Francisco with unprecedented fury. This was not just a rainy season, it was a biblical flood. The sky over the bay split open, and torrents of water poured down upon the fragile plaster empire. And then, what was supposed to happen slowly and poetically turned into a catastrophe. Staff, that fragile material of deception, couldn't hold up. Designed for a light, melancholic patina, it began to get soggy, like a cardboard box in a downpour. We see close-ups. Water seeps into microcracks, freezes at night, expanding them, and by morning, entire chunks of molding break off from the facades. The paint, imitating noble travertine, bubbles and peels, revealing ugly gray patches and dirty jute fibers. The idea of noble ruins had turned into the nightmare of premature decay. The palace began to fall apart before the first visitor had even seen it. Panic reigned on the construction site. The exposition's opening was just weeks away. The race against time had become a desperate battle against the weather. Special cosmetic crews were formed. Day and night, in the pouring rain, workers hung from scaffolding, performing an absurd task. Like field surgeons, They patched up the fresh wounds on the palace's body. They smeared cracks with new plaster, which immediately began to soak. They touched up crumbling sections with paint, which the next shower would wash away. It was a Sisyphean labor, an endless, exhausting battle against entropy. Every day, nature dealt new blows, and the men tried to preserve the illusion of integrity and grandeur. The entire grand design, this whole multi-million-dollar PR campaign, was hanging by a thread. In those desperate weeks, a frightening truth became apparent. The palace wasn't just fragile, it was ephemeral. It was a dream that threatened to dissipate before morning even came. And all the heroism of its creators now lay not in building something great, but simply in keeping this magnificent fake from total collapse until opening day. They were no longer building a palace. They were desperately embalming its still living, yet already decaying body. While workers battled floods on the construction site, another, unseen catastrophe was unfolding in quiet offices. In August 1914, telegraph machines around the world began to tap out alarming messages. In distant Europe, in Sarajevo, a shot was fired that set the entire continent ablaze. The First World War had begun. For Charles Moore and his committee of millionaires, this was not just a news headline. It was a financial Armageddon. The Grand Exposition in San Francisco was not just an American project. 33 countries and 28 states had invested millions in building their own pavilions. This money, which had flowed in a steady stream from London, Paris, and Berlin, was the lifeblood of the entire project. And overnight, that stream dried up. European governments, gripped by war fever, instantly froze all foreign expenditures. Financial markets crashed. The lines of credit the organizers had been counting on evaporated. The project, already teetering on the edge, was now in a state of freefall. We see Charles Moore in his office. He is no longer an all-powerful dictator, but a man on the brink of despair. The mountains of unpaid bills on his desk grow taller each day. Contractors are threatening to halt work. Thousands of workers could be left without pay. This entire shining city, nearly completed on a swamp, risked becoming the most expensive ghost town in history. This was the moment of truth. The entire gigantic machine for creating a new image for San Francisco could collapse, burying the reputations and fortunes of California's most powerful men under its plaster rubble. Moore had to use all his connections, all his authority. He scrambled between banks, securing new loans against personal guarantees. He appealed to the patriotism of local businessmen, convincing, almost forcing them to open their wallets once more to save the city's honor. He transformed from a dictator into a supplicant. The war, raging thousands of miles away, reached the shores of California not with the roar of cannons, but with the silence in bank vaults. And in that silence, the fate of the Palace of Fine Arts was being decided. It could have died before it was ever born, becoming a silent monument not to the strength of the American spirit, but to a global catastrophe that proved stronger than any plan, no matter how ambitious. Every dollar found in those days was won in a fight. Every bag of plaster bought to repair the facades was paid for with nerves and humiliation. The illusion was very expensive, and its price was rising by the day. Despite the war, financial chaos, and merciless weather, they had done it. By February 1915, the city of plaster was ready. But its creators had saved their masterstroke for last, the final, most powerful act of illusion, intended to completely erase the memory of filth, debt, and despair. That act was light. When the sun set behind the Golden Gate Bridge, which did not yet exist, the exhibition did not die. It was reborn. More than 100,000 floodlights, carefully hidden behind cornices, in bushes, and even underwater, burst to life all at once. It was a technological miracle, never before seen. The plaster city transformed into a magical, ethereal vision. By day, the exhibition showcased the power of industry and architecture. By night, it demonstrated power over darkness itself. This was the America of the 21st century, peering into its future. And in this spectacle of light, the Palace of Fine Arts was given a special role. Unlike the other buildings, which were bathed in direct, triumphant light, Bernard Maybeck's creation was illuminated differently. The light sources were hidden at the base of the columns, aimed upward. The light glided over the curves of the rotunda, snatching the sorrowful faces of the weeping maidens from the darkness, creating deep, mysterious shadows. The palace didn't shine. It glowed from within, and the main trick unfolded on the surface of the lagoon. The water, black as tar, transformed into a perfect mirror. And in it, a double of the palace was born, a surreal, trembling picture, receding into a bottomless depth. The illusion was doubled. It seemed that beneath the real palace existed its ghostly, underwater brother. This was the culmination of the deceit embedded in the very essence of this place. By day, in the sunlight, these were ruins. You could see the cracks in the plaster, the flaws in the repairs, all its material falsity. But at night, in the magical glow of the floodlights, all this prose vanished. Only pure magic remained. It was a brilliant calculation. By day, the palace appealed to the intellect, to philosophical reflections on time and decay. At night, it struck straight at the heart, bypassing reason. It became pure emotion. It was both a monument to the past and a vision from the future, a demonstration of American technological might wrapped in the melancholy mantle of ancient Rome. And in this glow, no one remembered that all this beauty was merely plaster and wood, granted only 1 year of life. At night, the illusion was absolute. February 20th, 1915. Opening day. San Francisco held its breath. Hundreds of thousands of people filled the avenues of the temporary city. This was the moment of truth, the moment for which millions of dollars had been spent, for which floods and financial storms had been endured. And the triumph was deafening. The crowd roared, orchestras blared. Charles Moore, standing on the grandstand, saw his dream, his statement, come to life. He had won. He had proven to the world that San Francisco had not just survived, but had risen from the ashes, even stronger and more ambitious. Newspapers around the world gushed with praise, calling the exhibition the 8th wonder of the world. The Palace of Fine Arts, which just yesterday seemed a dubious fantasy, instantly became the public's favorite. People stood for hours by the lagoon, enchanted by its melancholy beauty. They didn't read the philosophical messages encoded within it. They simply felt. They saw in it something more than just a pavilion. They saw the soul of this entire Vanity Fair. Moore had achieved his goal. The investors were happy. The visitors were ecstatic. But behind the scenes of this celebration, in the quiet of law offices, a document already lay on the table that turned this entire triumph into a farce. The fact was, the land on which this shining city stood did not belong to the organizers. It belonged to the federal government of the United States. It was the territory of the military's Fort Mason, and the Army had loaned this land on one condition only. A strict, non-negotiable decree had been signed. 10 months from now, immediately after the exhibition closed, every single building must be demolished. The territory was to be returned to its original, empty state. Everyone who applauded that day was applauding a ghost. Everyone who admired the grandeur of the columns was looking at a dead man whose funeral had merely been postponed. This entire triumph was just a temporary illusion, shadowed from the very beginning by a death sentence. The Palace of Fine Arts, like all its neighbors, was born to die. Its fate was sealed. Its beauty was but a flash before inevitable oblivion. And as the crowd celebrated its birth, the clock had already begun to count down to its execution. This entire grand spectacle was merely a prelude to total annihilation. Sentenced to death, the palace lived its short but dazzlingly bright life. For 288 days, it became one of the world's leading cultural centers. Behind its plaster walls, in a vast exhibition hall nearly a quarter of a mile long, a real treasure was housed. 11,400 works of art, brought from all over the planet. This wasn't just an exhibition. It was a statement. While Europe was immolating itself in the fires of war, San Francisco was demonstrating that it was the new safe harbor for world culture. American collectors, fearing for the safety of their masterpieces, sent canvases by Monet, Renoir, and Munch here. Millions of visitors, many of whom had never seen real painting, walked through these halls for the first time, breathing the air of great art. But the party ended. The fanfares fell silent, the crowds dispersed, and the builders who had just erected this city returned to destroy it. One by one, the majestic palaces of the exhibition fell to wrecking balls, turning into mountains of rubble. All except one. The Palace of Fine Arts received a temporary stay of execution, thanks to the intercession of influential citizens. But this wasn't life. It was a slow fading. And then its second, strange and prosaic life began. The building created for the contemplation of high art was given over to the most mundane needs. Its history became a surrealistic kaleidoscope. Here are the 30s, the era of jazz and the Great Depression. On the grounds around the crumbling rotunda, the city authorities install 18 lighted tennis courts. The sound of balls hitting rackets echoes off the columns where the grieving maidens are frozen. Here is the Second World War. The palace is requisitioned by the army. Its huge, echoing hall, where impressionist paintings once hung, is now packed with rows of military jeeps and trucks. The smell of gasoline and machine oil mixes with the smell of rotting plaster. Here is 1947. The war is over, but the humiliations continue. The exhibition hall is converted into a giant warehouse. Its only inhabitants are millions of copies of San Francisco phone books, stacked in giant paper mountains. The Temple of Art had become a repository for outdated information. Each new tenant was another step toward oblivion. The building that was meant to speak of eternity was used for the most temporary of things. It slowly crumbled, flaked, and rotted. And it seemed that no one cared about it anymore. Its great past was almost forgotten, and it simply had no future. Salvation didn't arrive in the form of a knight on a white horse. It came in the form of 40 years of oblivion. 40 years of slow, inexorable decay. It was this long process of decomposition that paradoxically saved the palace from final death. Time and weather were doing exactly what Maybeck had intended, but with terrifying efficiency. Plaster crumbled in chunks, exposing rusting rebar like the veins of a corpse. The wooden frame rotted from within. The columns became covered in moss and lichen. Wild plants grew through cracks in the floor. The palace turned into real, genuine ruins, not romantic ones, but dangerous ones. City authorities fenced it off, posting signs, "No trespassing." The bulldozers were already warming their engines. Its demolition was not just a plan, but a sanitary necessity. And at that very moment, when the sentence seemed final, a miracle occurred. Or rather, two miracles. The first was quiet and aristocratic. Phoebe Hearst, the powerful Grand Dame of California society, refused to accept the loss. She founded the Palace Preservation League, investing her own money to at least halt its immediate destruction. She bought time. The second miracle arrived in the form of a short, portly Englishman with a grim sense of humor. In 1958, Alfred Hitchcock came to San Francisco to shoot his new film. He was looking for a location that could embody on screen the idea of haunting memory, melancholy, and fatal love. And he found it here, in these abandoned, overgrown ruins. The key scene of the film Vertigo is shot at the lagoon. James Stewart's character silently follows the enigmatic Kim Novak along the water. In the background is the dilapidated, frightening, and mesmerizing rotunda. Hitchcock didn't just use the palace as a set piece, he made it a character. He captured its soul on film, the soul of a place frozen between life and death, between beauty and decay. Millions of people around the world saw the palace through Hitchcock's eyes, and that image, mystical, romantic, a little sinister, was forever etched into the cultural memory. It was no longer just an abandoned pavilion. It had become a symbol. Public opinion, previously indifferent, exploded. People suddenly realized what they were losing. They saw not danger in these ruins, but poetry. They fell in love not with the perfect postcard palace of 1915, but with its wounded, imperfect, yet honest form. They refused to lose their noble ruins. And this popular revolt against the bulldozers proved stronger than any orders from city officials. Hitchcock didn't save the palace. He simply showed people what they already felt, but were afraid to admit to themselves. He gave them a reason to fight for their dream. The people's love gave it a will, but its resurrection required capital. And it appeared. Philanthropist Walter Johnson, a man who built his empire on trucking, did what the city authorities no longer dared to do. He wrote a check for millions of dollars to save the soul of San Francisco. And then, the story of the Palace of Fine Arts took its final, most incredible and brutal turn. To save it, it had to be killed. This was the final, most crucial paradox. The original building of plaster and wood was too ravaged by time. It could not be restored. It could only be sacrificed. In 1964, construction equipment entered the palace grounds, but not to repair it. Before the eyes of the entire city, which had fought so fiercely for its preservation, the palace was completely, methodically, ruthlessly demolished. The original, the very one that saw the crowds of 1915, the one that served as a warehouse for jeeps and a set for Hitchcock, was destroyed. It turned to dust, just as its creator had predicted. The illusion died. And then, on this cleared land, the resurrection began. On the very same spot, they began to erect its exact copy, but this time from reinforced concrete, from the material of eternity. We see workers taking casts from the surviving fragments of the old stucco. They are creating molds to cast in concrete, not just columns and bas-reliefs, but the very memory of time. They meticulously recreate the texture of the old material, its cracks, its imperfections. They are turning the traces of decay into an eternal ornament. This wasn't just construction. It was the casting of a death mask. And here it stands today, the same, and yet completely different. An immortal copy of a mortal original. A temporary lie built for money became an eternal truth thanks to love. The building that was meant to die was killed and resurrected to prove the most cherished idea of its mystic creator. An idea that pragmatists and businessmen once laughed at. Civilizations crumble, empires turn to dust, and beauty is immortal. Our journey to the heart of the Palace of Fine Arts became an immersion into a great deception that turned out to be the truth. We were looking for a solid foundation, but found only a drained swamp and ambition. We were looking for pure art, but saw the calculations of industrial barons built by the hands of nameless immigrants. We were looking for eternity in stone, but discovered only plaster, wood, and jute, sentenced to death the moment they were born. And here, at this intersection of cynicism and dreams, lies the main lesson of this story. True value is created not by purity of origin, but by the power of human feeling. Meaning is born not from the initial intent, but from the collective will to love, to remember, and to save. This palace is not a monument to architecture. It is a monument to the human ability to turn a lie into a myth, and a myth into a reality more solid than the concrete from which it was ultimately cast. If a lie believed by millions can give birth to true beauty, then what is truth? And can what we create outgrow our own intentions, acquire a soul, and one day demand that we save it, even from ourselves? The story of the palace is not over. It continues in everyone who looks at it today. What does it mean to you? Share your thoughts in the comments, because it is in this shared dialogue that immortality is born. If this investigation made you think, please support our channel. Your subscription allows us to continue searching for the truth hidden behind beautiful facades.